Sometimes we approach Scripture purely from the theological point of view. And being the teacher that I am, many times I tend to focus just on the theology or the spirituality. And that's certainly one way to approach the Scripture. Another is to consider the practical entry points into the stories. And those entry points are often the historical entry point. For instance, in this text from Isaiah, the northern kingdom of Israel has been destroyed. The armies are encamped outside the city of Jerusalem, and the people are expecting their end very shortly. And so the prophet speaks to the king and says, turn to God, ask God, God will help you. And the king says, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to bother God with this problem. And then the prophecy comes. And a part of it is how theology develops. And now I'm going to take too long to explain this. But the image is of a young girl giving birth to a child, seemingly in a miraculous way, that it becomes a sign to the king that God's future is not in the destruction of Jerusalem, but rather in the way of life that this child points to. So in the challenge of this text is to understand that it's not a prediction of the future, but a promise, as we've heard in the prayers, a promise in the way that God works. I promise that this future will be down this path, and what you have to do is to trust that this future will occur as we go forward. When it comes to including this text in the gospel, what we are challenged to think is that the gospel writer is trying to make a connection. You see, this birth of this child to Joseph and Mary is the fulfillment of that prediction that was made back 500 years before through the prophet Isaiah. There's a lot of theology that can go with that, but in that theological reasoning and process, it moves us to have a certain perspective on things that, is well-intentioned, if you will, but maybe is not always the best path to take. And so the perspective that it invites us to have is to see that promises made in the past turn into actual predictions of future events. And when those future events are fulfilled, then we can all relax and say, you see, this is what this means. Jesus is that promised one, and you can go down that particular path. So that's a perspective that's offered. And I hope we understand that when it comes to the scripture, that it really is more the perspective, if you will, of the writer to a given audience, so that the perspective is tailored to fit the audience more than anything, than it is for us. Meaning that Isaiah is being written to a particular audience about 700 years before the Common Era, and is not intending it to be written for us. That it becomes scripture over time involves our way of interpreting the scripture, not as a fundamentalist might, that what's said there, everything is absolutely to be taken as it is and to be understood that way, but rather in a more flexible way of approaching the text, that there are, as I use the phrase, entry points that help us to understand that it involves the interpretation that we give. And again, we come with a certain perspective even for that interpretation. I tell you all of that because many years ago, I was teaching a class on the Gospel of John. And in teaching this particular text, I was using all the authority that a teacher has, meaning I was speaking with great enthusiasm, great conviction, and a part of Carla and Rebecca and any teachers know that sometimes, even if you are not sure exactly what you are teaching or even agree with what you're teaching, if you teach it with great conviction and persuasiveness, the class will believe you, and so that's how it works, right? That you have to do so with great authority. So there I am in front of the class, and this is the text, and it's awful to include another text after we've already got two texts, but this is the text. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come. But when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that a child is born into the world. Now, I just suggested that I'm teaching with great authority and persuasiveness. And so I'm teaching this, and all of a sudden it dawned on me, what the heck do I know about this? And I looked out on the class, and it was all women in the class. What the heck does a man know about giving birth, right? We often, and this is the problem that we have in the world, that often men speak on behalf of women with the presumption that we know what's going on, when there is no way that we have any clue at all. And so I stopped and I said, what do I know about giving birth? And the women in the class sat there shocked because it was an admission that as a teacher, I had no clue what I was talking about. And they all kind of, politely laughed at me. And so I began to ask, well, what's this about? Now, I'm not going to do that this morning, but, and they gave me some eye-opening experiences. I do have to tell you that, again, many years ago, I listened to a particular theologian tell the story about wanting to be a part of the birth of a baby. When you're a priest and a celibate, the chances are that you get to experience the birth of a child is zero, more or less zero. Now that there's married clergy around, I suppose that it's increased the percentages of opportunity. But at that point, 40 plus years ago, there was no chance. And so I said that in a given sermon. Well, lo and behold, a family in the church with a rather late child on the way, meaning that they'd had 3 older children, and this was a child coming when they didn't expect it. And they said, well, guess what? We're having this baby, and we'd like you to be there for the birth of this baby. Well, I immediately said yes, because obviously, if the opportunity arises, you take it, right? Because it may not ever come again. And so they said, you just have to be ready. And I said, don't worry, I will be ready. The call came about 10 o'clock one evening, and off I went to the hospital and got into the delivery room. And as I say on the Christmas video, there are just things that a male celibate priest should not see, but we did see, because there you are in the birth room experiencing the birth of this baby. But I have to tell you, long story short, I'm not going to go into any more details about that. But to watch the mother, first of all, hold the baby, and the father standing there watching her hold the baby, and watching them check the baby out, meaning, does it have all its fingers, all of its toes, is it? And then to watch them beam with joy. So now I knew, not personally, but now I knew by way of analogy what that biblical text was about. Although I have to think, and well, I won't say that. I have to imagine that in the perspective that's given, that often we're challenged to step into the shoes of someone else, to see the reality of the world from their perspective, when maybe we're much more comfortable standing in our own place, in our own shoes, thinking that our perspective is the norm for everyone else. Now, the reason why I say that is because in this story today, it's obvious that the perspective that we are invited to consider is Joseph's perspective. Now, that may not be strange or unusual, but if we think of our spiritual, theological, historical, cultural way, that we tend to approach the birth story from Mary's perspective. Obviously, she's the mother, and therefore is the one whose perspective matters the most. Today, we're invited, because we're in Matthew's cycle of reading, to consider the birth from Matthew's perspective. Not that he's going to personally have the experience of labor and going through childbirth, but something is going on that we're asked to consider. And here again, it's strange because the norm of perspective is often from a man's point of view. So therefore, it should be that Joseph's perspective is the norm. And yet in Christianity, the norm is Mary's perspective, which is interesting. Now think about it for a moment. The norm often is the man's perspective. But in Christianity, we're invited to consider the woman's perspective on birth, not the man's perspective. And yet, this text today puts us in Joseph's shoes. He is described, and now listen to how this unfolds. He's described as being an upright man because he discovers that something's wrong about this situation. It's scandalous, to be honest with you. It's scandalous that his intended, his fiance, is pregnant and he doesn't have a clue because he wasn't the one that got her pregnant. How does this happen? I don't know how it happens. Well, I do know how it happens, but it's not in the perspective, it's not in the scenario of the text itself to tell us how this happened. But the suggestion is, the scholars make the suggestion, that there were terrible rumors going around early in Christianity that suggested that this birth of this child was just not, how could you say it? It just was not kosher, to use a Jewish word. It just wasn't kosher. And you see, if your rhetoric and your press releases and all of the way that you argue the case, so to speak, puts doubt into people's minds about the birth of the one that you are supposed to be following, then it draws doubt to everything else about it. If the birth is not kosher and therefore came about by some scandalous activity of Mary, then she should be put away. As often in history, that when young girls become pregnant and there's no way of knowing who got her pregnant, that often young girls were sent away. Were sent away off somewhere to a relative, so as not to scandalize the family, not to bring shame upon the family. And you see, well, in this text, it's all out there for us to consider. When the norm of perspective is to think shame, and yes, Joseph would be right in putting her away, we're asked to consider a different response to the situation and events that we find ourselves in. He's described as an upright man or a righteous man. And here in the long tradition of biblical tradition, that a righteous man may not always understand why they do things that they do, but they believe somehow or another that what they're doing is the right thing, the moral, the ethical thing. And so Joseph is described as a righteous man who is obviously going to follow the law, and then following the law, then indeed, he's doing what culturally, socially, politically, economically, he's expected to do. A voice comes and says, no, you may think that you're right in following the norm of the community, but I'm asking you to follow a different path, There's another perspective. The perspective is that somehow or another, this shameful, scandalous pregnancy, when everyone is willing to jump on the bandwagon to send her away, then we're asked not to agree that unwed mothers is somehow the norm, but that somehow or another, the way we respond to this might need us to consider different things. Here, the angel says, something about this child is, from the perspective of God, different than what your perspective, Joseph, and even Mary. That something about this child you have to consider differently. This child is not going to be a bastard because we don't know who his father was, Joseph. But this child is going to be different because of what he's going to do, who he's going to be, what he's going to do in inviting others into this new perspective. In fact, as Isaiah mentions, his name is going to be, Jesus, of course. No, theologically, spiritually, his name is going to be, prophetically, his name is going to be Emmanuel. And I put into the e-sojourner that this means God is with us, or with God among us. That something about this child that we're going to have to pay attention to from this point on. And what we're going to have to pay attention to is the way that God is in him, in different ways to think about it. If we're all made in the image and likeness of God, as Genesis 1 says, then what is going to be anything different or unique or odd about this baby as it begins to grow and mature and live out its life? Well, that's what we're going to have to wait for the whole rest of next year to do. What is so different about this child that even his own father couldn't see, because his perspective was not to bring shame upon Mary or himself or the baby, but rather to send her, no, I've just been told I can't do that, because the perspective that I'm now being asked to accept sees it differently. Step in, not into Mary's shoes, but step into God's shoes, so to speak. And in stepping into God's shoes, what we're asked to consider is, one, a response. How do we respond to the scandals? How do we respond to the shame that we often experience as a result of bad things happening? How do we respond to those things? It's not to normalize the outrage, but rather to suggest that we might just need to have a little bit more compassion and understanding. I think of that because I'm in the midst of a class right now, and the week is dealing with issues such as physician-assisted suicide, euthanasia, and suicide. And in the class, the Christian perspective is to first name suicide as a sin. And I ask the students, is that helpful to tell somebody who's considering suicide, you're about to commit a sin? How helpful is that going to be to them? Probably not very helpful at all. One, because maybe they don't even understand what sin is, or even think that what they're about to do is sinful in any way. So what do we need to respond? How do we need to respond when that occurs, or when we are confronted with it? The suggestion is to maybe consider a little bit more carefully the actions of people who might be in the midst of severe depression, mental illness, to take a little more care in how we respond instead of being outraged and angered. And I know I felt that when friends did commit suicide, to say, you're so selfish about this, that you only thought of yourself and not the rest of us. How did that, right, that Hollywood person just this last week that committed suicide, did he think of his family? I don't know. Does it matter? I don't know. But maybe because of the intensity of whatever he was going through at the moment, you see, the perspective is to take a different perspective. Again, it's not to say it's okay. It's just to say, do we put priority on the action or keep the focus on the person? And if the person is the one that we're asked to be compassionate towards and understanding of, then maybe that's how we respond. With love, with compassion, with some sense of, wow, how do we respond to mental illness? How do we respond to severe depression? Do we ignore it? Do we do anything about it? How much money do we invest in mental health care here in the state of Arizona? What do we tell homeless people who don't have access to good health care, don't get the meds that they need? And so therefore, their whole life is lived on the street because that's the only thing that they know. What do we respond to? You see, taking a different perspective, when I stood in front of that class and thought that I could teach a text about women going through labor and the intensity of that labor, and that I could somehow think that I had the right perspective, that when I realized that the women there didn't believe anything that I was saying, that I had to step over into the other shoes and say, tell me something about it. Tell me what this is about. Tell me what it's like. So that then I could begin to understand their perspective and stand in their shoes and have some degree of compassion and understanding. Maybe that's part of it. That this fourth Sunday of Advent is to ask us to make an evaluation of our perspective, so that in making an evaluation of our perspective, that coming into the new year, we might be able to see things differently, consider things differently, respond differently to the situations that will confront us.